Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Concord Bookshop and to this afternoon's event with Richard Horan, Rick Horan, the author of Seeds, One Man's Serendipitous Journey to find, to find the trees that inspired famous American writers from Faulkner to Kerouac, Welty to Wharton. I worked really hard trying to remember that whole subtitle. The book has its roots, if you will, in a family trip to Springfield, Illinois several years ago when Rick and his family visited the home of Abraham Lincoln. He was perusing the archives and saw a photo of the president outside, outside sitting next to a basswood tree, and he was surprised and amazed to discover that the tree was still standing. He went outside and collected some of the seeds, taking them home, intending to harvest them, and this led to a sense of purpose in this act. So he went on further pilgrimages across the United States, harvesting missions, I think you're calling them, to the West Coast, New England, and the Deep South. Along the way, his compulsive seed collecting morphed from a hobby into a clearly defined mission to uncover the stories behind the trees that served as silent observers to these literary Americans. His quest included a stop here in Concord, where he walked in Thoreau's footsteps around Walden Pond. He visited Emerson's home, and he wondered about the apple tree, or one of the apple trees in front of the Concord Museum. Bill McKibben, author of Earth, says, "What an invigorating way to be reminded of the depth of America's literary and natural heritage." Spike Carlsen, author of A Splintered History of Wood, says, "Seeds reads like a talk between John Muir and Bill Bryson. Horan takes an unlikely premise and takes a journey that's poignant, insightful, and unexpectedly humorous. More than a book about seeds, it's about literary heroes, forensic forestry, and self-discovery." Richard Horan is a novelist, an English teacher, and a book reviewer for several national publications. He lives in Oswego, New York, where the seeds that he has collected are being cultivated by an arborist. Please help me welcome Rick Horan.
Thank you. Well, what a complete introduction. I don't think I have to do any more talking at this point. I can just take questions. It's great. I'm always so impressed to see people come out to events like this. It just proves to me how committed you are to the written word, which of course is my life. So thank you. I'm honored to be here. I told myself that I was going to start backwards today because I get to talking and then I forget some of the important things. So I'm going to start at the end because I always forget it. And then usually there's a plant in the audience who will ask the right questions and I bring it out. So this time I'm going to be sure that I won't forget these two items. First of all, the trees, the seeds in the trees, where are they? I've gone around the country and I've collected seeds from the trees of my favorite authors and many of my heroes' childhood homes. And for many years they sat in my basement in boxes. And I also have grown some without much success, but I have grown some. At the very end of the project, literally weeks before it was finished and ready for the printing, I found an arborist out of Clarence, New York. He is the president of the New York State Arborists Association, a man named David Sedaris. He has half of all the seeds that I have. He has cataloged them. He has them stored, and he has built a greenhouse, a large greenhouse, probably about the size of this store, believe it or not, and is growing these seeds as we speak. He calls them sprouts. So he says they're not even seedlings yet, nor are they saplings. Seeds and growing seeds into trees is a lot harder than people may think. The propagal pressure of lots and lots of seeds hitting the ground, most of those seeds are expected not to live. So to take up and gather seeds and then simply try to grow them into trees is a long process, and it's not always very fruitful. In any case, his name is the Tree Doctor, and you can go to the Tree Doctor or to my website, literaryseeds.com, and find out more about these trees and what's going to happen to them. Right now, you can probably get them if you write to him and ask him if he would sell them or give them to you, but his plans are sort of later on down the road, 7 years or so. He hopes to have the trees hardy enough, tall enough, vigorous enough where you can take them away and plant them. But of course, some of these that are from more tropical environments will not grow in the Concord area, and he'll probably have that caveat with that. The other aspect that I wanted to talk about is the illustrations. This is an illustrated book, and that also happened at the last minute, where we were going to include all of the photographs that I had taken of each and every one of the trees from which I'd carted away seeds. And we decided that based on these wonderful illustrations that my sister and nephew had sketched early on, that we should include them with each chapter. So these beautiful illustrations are the work of my very talented sister, who is an artist, and my nephew, also an artist, David Horan Ferrer and Matthew Ferrer. And those illustrations are actually going to be displayed at the Florence Griswold Museum in Lyme, Connecticut on June 3rd, if you're interested in seeing all of them. I think there are about 30 altogether. All right. Those two items, believe it or not, I always forget to talk about. Let me say a couple of things about the inspiration between myself, trees, writers, and seeds. It's such a rich idea that it's even hard for me to articulate it, especially at this point. But I will say that as a writer, and I think all writers will share this feeling, that we have a special bond with trees, because since the beginning of the written word, wood flesh has been our medium. And so for us to bring life to our creative ideas and thoughts, trees have had to be sacrificed. And I know that any writer worth his or her salt is saying to him or herself before starting the journey of another book is that the book better be worth the paper it's printed on. That is not a cliche. We take this very seriously, that a book, which is a very tactile experience, now we're in the day of Kindle and iBooks and so on, which is redefining the book world and the written word. But we're still here, we're still holding the books, we're still interacting with them at this level. Writers feel a very special bond with trees for this very reason. And also the symbolism of trees. We were talking about roots, deep roots, the rootedness of our ideas and our thoughts and our environment. All of these symbols are how we create our ideas, writers. One other idea that I'd like to talk about as far as writers and trees is the idea that we are, as writers, really the product of our environment. So the trees, the environment, the vegetation, the smells, the odors, the flowers, the lilacs, these play a very, very important psychological and symbolic point in our lives as writers. So writers from the West are different from writers from the Midwest. Writers from the East are far different from writers from the South. And it is not something that's cant or cliche to say that. Much of that reason is the vegetation, it's the environment, it's the odors. These are very, very, very vital aspects of who we are, not only as writers, but as human beings. And so the smells that we have, especially from our childhood, are hardwired into the circuitry of our neurons. And wherever we go, those smells that are not from where we grew up are going to always seem foreign to us, so that when we come back home, we can smell that, even if we were, deprived of sight and hearing and so on. I think that it would be quite easy to locate our own environment through our sense of smell. And so this is something that I always like to mention, to talk about what is it that I was doing, why was I going out collecting the seeds from the trees of my heroes. And this is one of the reasons that these trees have a significant impact and effect on our lives. And let me give you one of my favorite examples. Recently, I just got back from Jackson, Mississippi, and I visited Eudora Welty's house. Eudora Welty lived at the same address for over 70 years. She lives at 1119 Pinehurst Street in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's a beautiful location. It's a very suburban kind of street. And she worked out in her backyard with her mother when her mother was alive, and then afterwards in her garden. And she had a two-tiered garden. She had roses up top and sort of flower beds down below. And she worked out there every day. And it's well documented that most of her creative work was done in the garden. So while she was creating out there, this is Mississippi, mind you, it gets very hot. And I was just down there 2 weeks ago, and I can tell you, even in late April, you don't want to be out in that sun. And all around there are these wonderful water oak trees. There's a little woods behind her house, and all of those trees provided much needed shade. There was one particular tree on what used to be the neighbor's lawn, but is now owned by the Eudora Welty Museum, a water oak, that it was very big, rather large, and at that time of day, its shadow was being cast across Miss Welty's garden. And so I give that as a classic example of the connection I was making in gathering seeds from that tree. That tree had more influence on Eudora Welty than just about anything around her, I would venture to guess, because of the shade that it was providing, the smells, the vegetation being near. So it's this type of story that again drives this point home of what kind of contact was I after in gathering these seeds. Another really magical, and again I get a little bit more occult as I go along, so if you start to smile and shake your head, I know that okay, my weirdness is starting to show through, which is good. That writers, we all have our special belief system. So the story will get a little weirder as I explain that after a while I discovered a sort of magic happening with this book. This book was formulated as an idea based on, and you articulated it so well, coming upon that photograph of Abraham Lincoln going outside and realizing those seeds are the same seeds of the tree that he stood next to and had his picture taken. And that's where the idea began. And then from there I went to Twain's home and discovered some trees that probably were alive when little Sam Clemens was running around. I went down to Graceland. Elvis has beautiful trees on his property there, all of which knew the king himself, and I gathered seeds there. But as I go along, I realized that my original idea of just gathering the seeds, storing them in my basin, and growing them was to just make a grove of my own. That was my original plan. So I was going to gather these seeds, keep them in my basement, try and grow them, and then eventually get some property and have a little literary grove of my own, and then give them out as presents, invite people over to take a look at the trees, look at this magic tree from William Faulkner's Roanoke, and so on. So that was the original idea. And I was happy with it until I met my editor and publisher at HarperCollins, who came up to visit me when I was teaching a college writing class, and he was going to speak to my students about the publishing business. And so I brought him in my back room and I showed him my collection of trees. I had little Jack Kerouacs growing, and L. Frank Baum trees, so on. And so he looked at them, he was amazed, and yet he had this sort of epiphany that, no, you're not going to have a grove of your own, you're going to write about it. So I got all excited. Yes, I'll write a story about this. I'll go around the country. I'll get a van, man, and I'll paint pictures of trees on it, And so, when I kind of came back down to earth, I realized, well, you go to a place, you pick up some seeds, you put them in your pocket, you get back in the car, what's there to write about, right? And so this was my preoccupation for a while. So he said, you know what, just do it. You're going to have to go back to, so I went back to a couple of places. I went back to the Wizard of Oz Memorial Oak Grove in Mattydale, New York, just down the road, which I had visited and I had seeds. So I went back there and I experienced it all over again, and I found seeds, and this sort of magic happened. Then I went to Lowell, Massachusetts, Kerouac's Pawtucketville, actually, and I found some trees and seeds there, and then I collected them. And then, as I went and I experienced these places, something began to happen. It wasn't like, Miami Vice where people start shooting at me and there's, this big car chase and so on. But there were very subtle things that began to happen. People would show up. There would be, I would meet people. Certain little events would begin to happen so that after a little while I realized there was a magic happening in my reverence towards these people. It was the idea that you go with your heart open, with humility, with reverence, with excitement, and the message that was there to begin with from people like Eudora Welty, William Faulkner, Jack Kerouac, you can find it. Their message abides in going on pilgrimages to these places and looking for them, looking and trying to make that physical connection, which is the trees, of course. Let me give you another example to illustrate this. A lot of these authors, I had a long list of about 90 names. So originally, I was going to write about 90, people. And by the time I got to number 27, my publisher said, well, you're already 20,000 words over, so we've got to call an end to this. So I couldn't get to all 90,000. I did, or to 90, but I got to 70, to 75 just about, and ended up writing about 30. But what I found was some of the places that I went, the ones that I just happened on because my publisher thought, well, while you're there, why don't you go visit this place? When I went to a place like, for example, Flannery O'Connor's house, I wasn't a big Flannery O'Connor fan. I'd read a couple of Flannery O'Connor stories, but I was being taken around by a man from the South by the name of Stephen Wallace, and he asked me, well, where do you want to go? Which places? Well, I want to go to this place, that place. Okay, we'll go there, but let me take you to some other places too. So the first place was Flannery O'Connor in Midgeville, Georgia. And so we pulled off the road. We were talking. We had quite a long conversation after he'd picked me up at the airport. We pulled into our driveway, and there was a steel bar cutting us off. We couldn't go in. And he literally had to slide the car to a stop. And so he jumps out. I can't believe they're closed. I had checked on it. They were supposed to be open. Makes a couple of phone calls. No go. We can't get in. And I realized Flannery O'Connor did not want me collecting seeds at her house. Just the way, if you've read any Flannery O'Connor, you know that she does not kindly enjoy people torturing her text, right? There's no reading between the lines of Flannery O'Connor, and there's no symbols to be found around her place, right? Flannery O'Connor tells her stories. They're weird stories, but that's all there is. So she didn't, what's the famous expression, suffer fools gladly, or suffer snoops gladly. So we backed out. We went immediately to Carson McCullers' place in Columbia, Georgia. Now that was just the opposite. We pulled up out front. There's a sign that says Carson McCullers' childhood home. It looks like someone's still living there. In fact, my friend Wallace knocked on the door, found out there was someone living there. No, we couldn't go in. It wasn't a museum. It wasn't like that. It was just a house that marked that where she lived, and go ahead and walk around. Well, she had this big, beautiful, soaring magnolia tree right out in front of her house. Has anyone ever seen a huge southern magnolia? Well, these are amazing. They're like Christmas trees. And they're also called cucumber trees, right? And they have those big cones with the blood red little dollops of seeds that squirt out from these big cones. Well, they were everywhere, all over the lawn. Now, Carson McCullers is one of my favorites, and everyone knows that if you read Carson McCullers, she's like the ultimate realist writer, right? I mean, her stories are about real people, and the characterization, the dialogue is just right out there in your face. It's just totally real, and she's got an open door, right? So if you want to know Carson McCullers, read her books, and there she is. She's right there for you to experience. And so it was just like her house. And so it's experiences like that that made me realize that, again, there's this abiding message of the authors in taking a pilgrimage and going and interacting with their homes, especially their trees. My favorite, people have asked, well, what's your favorite? You know, I've gone to about 75 of these homes. And not only homes, but also historical places as well. But I would have to say, probably my favorite story is Muhammad Ali's house in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, he's the only athlete in the book. Originally, I was going to have athletes, musicians, of course, historical sites, but the publisher really wanted us to, to focus on the literary scene, so we did that. But anyway, to get to Muhammad Ali's Louisville, Kentucky home where he grew up, he lived on Grand Avenue on the east side of Louisville, which is a tough section. With the internet now, it's really easy to find out where people grew up, which is wonderful. You know, the internet now, you can do research so easily. 20 years ago, it would have been really hard to find that address, but now it's pretty easy. So I took the bus across town. I walked through a couple of tough neighborhoods, and finally I got to Grand Avenue. Grand Avenue is just as it describes itself. It's this big, long street, about a quarter mile long, and they have those big double-wide shotgun houses in Louisville. They all had very nice front lawns. All the front lawns were well manicured. And on both sides, there was just lawns all the way down, except for one house way down on the right had a tree out front. So as I got walking, a little voice in the back of my head told me something magic was going to happen. And sure enough, when I walked down to the end, 3302 Grand Avenue, where Muhammad Ali grew up, was the only house on that street on both sides that had a tree out front. And that tree was a northern catalpa tree. Does everyone know what a catalpa looks like? Well, the catalpa tree is the only northern, it's the northern version, I guess, of the Pollyanna. It has the largest leaves of any tree of the hardwood variety in North America, and they're in the shape of a heart. And those leaves are about the size of a standard sheet of paper. So here is this giant catalpa tree that's easily, 100 years old, that must have known little Cassius Clay when he was running around. And there are these beautiful, poetic, heart-shaped leaves out on the front lawn. It didn't look like anyone even lived there, and I wasn't just going to go start pulling pods off the tree. So I knocked on the door, and this beautiful little girl answered. And a moment later, so did their mother. When I told her what my mission was, they simply smiled and said, sure. And so there I was, like a maniac, jumping up, pulling those pods down. And the happy message there is also not only is that leaf in the shape of a heart and the most poetic tree, but it's also the easiest to grow. So my arborist loves the catalpas because he has a lot of those growing. All right, what else do I want to mention about my book? I also want to mention John Muir, who is sort of the father of the national park system. And he was a big and important figure in the writing of this book. So I wanted to start with John Muir, even though he wasn't the very first place I went to. I needed to get to John Muir's house. And if you haven't been to John Muir's house in Martinez, California, I suggest you go. It's just a wonderful place to connect to John Muir. He was the one character, the one literary figure that I was really intimidated by. A person who really took this whole nature movement by the scruff of the neck and moved it forward in this country. It was someone that I wanted to make sure that I approached with the right type of reverence and attitude. So when we got to his house, I had my nephew with me. I was really intimidated, and I didn't know what I should do, whether I should announce myself to the National Park Service to let them know what I was intending to do, that it was find seeds on his ground and pick them up. I was pretty sure that they wouldn't mind it, but maybe they had other plans, maybe like Monticello or Mount Vernon, where they actually do collect the seeds from those remaining witness trees and sell them, so that going there and collecting the seeds is not as easy. But I just sort of played it by ear, and we went up toward the house, and as soon as we got to the front door, we noticed all these wonderful trees around, and right on the ground were these seedlings literally growing up right out in front of the house. Well, I couldn't resist, and I knelt down and I started to dig one of those saplings up with my keys, just like you replace a divot on a green. And so I couldn't have been at that for more than 30 seconds when I heard someone approach and say, "Can I help you?" And I don't know if you know about these national park rangers, but they're pretty cool. They wear those big round brimmed hats, and they have the uniforms and stuff. And oh boy, I thought I was in trouble. So he said, no, can I help you? I mean, literally. How can I help you get that sapling? And he said, actually, that's not a good sapling. You should go over there under those trees. That's definitely, those saplings are definitely from this tree, which John Muir planted himself. And so, again, the magic of that moment where I realized that, if you have a good idea and you have the right reverence and respect and joy, the world does come up and help you and embrace your idea. And so this man sort of led me around and showed me where the famous fig tree that Muir had planted was. And I thought I found some figs. However, my nemesis, every book must have a nemesis. Well, in this book, my nemesis is the eastern gray squirrel. So the gray squirrel is like a trickster figure in this book. So whenever I thought I had the right, seeds and so on, the squirrels managed to fool me somehow. And so in this case, they had taken chestnuts from the nearby California chestnut tree, and they'd stored them at the base of this ancient fig with this, wonderful plaque outside. So my nephew and I thought we had found these amazing figs, but they weren't figs, they were chestnuts. Nonetheless, the squirrels won that round, but I continue to stay in the fight and continue to collect seeds. Final story. I guess my final story to share with you before I'll start taking questions, because I really do love to answer questions about my adventures, is my experience at Helen Keller's house. I was determined to end with her, and it was the last place that I gathered seeds. She grew up in Tuscumbia, Alabama, which is, pretty much northwestern part of Alabama. And that's really the heart of Dixie down there. As a northerner, I grew up in Connecticut and, went to school in Boston. Hanging out down in Alabama and Mississippi, I always feel a little uncomfortable because I feel so Eastern. And, when I open my mouth, I hear an accent come out when I'm down there. So to make a long story short, we got there on a Sunday, and the gate was closed. And I was really upset because I wanted that to be the last place that I would gather seeds. And we couldn't stay another day because we had a plane to catch. And so we sat in the car for a while and not, thinking of what we could possibly do, if we could make some phone calls. But We didn't think that would work. So I said, well, the best we can do is we can walk around the grounds, and maybe there are some trees that are, leaning over the fence, and we can find some seeds from them. So we walked around the house, and the closer we got to Ivy Green, the house itself, the louder the voices we heard coming from it were. We heard these loud voices coming from the house. And then as we got abreast of the house, we noticed that the gate was wide open. So even though it said closed and the gate was closed out front, on the side of the house, the gate was open, and there were voices coming from inside. So my nephew and I entered, and once I get collecting my seeds, I forget all other things about the world. And so I was probably there 45 minutes when he came running and said, "Hey, Uncle Ricky, the cops are here." And so I was wearing a tie-dye shirt with a peace signal on it, and my hair was down, so I looked kind of like Charles Manson. I hadn't shaven in a while, and sure enough, I looked up, and there was a policeman coming at me from all directions, 3 of them. One stayed out by the front gate, and so we were trapped, we were caught. And so they took our licenses and began, checking our names against their logs and so on, calling the radio dispatcher. And as we sat there, we thought, oh boy, what's going to happen? And my nephew at one point said, well, I don't know what they could possibly arrest us for. Reverse vandalism? I love that line. And they checked on us. I told them exactly what we were up to. And finally, the one cop said, well, what makes you think that you come in here on a day like today? It's closed. It says closed out front. And I said, well, I can tell you why. The voice is coming from the back. We heard all these voices, and the gate was open. And sure enough, the gate was open. The voices were coming from the back. Now, the voices coming from the back, someone had inadvertently left the recorder playing. So they have, I guess, a tour where they have just a cassette player playing, Helen Keller reading something. And so that was left on. And the gate, he said he'd never seen that open. He didn't know why that was open on a Sunday. It was always closed. It was some person's job at Ivy Green to close and lock that. But so he had to let us go. And so I always thought that it was Helen Keller's way of letting me in because she knew what I was after. Helen Keller is of course, a great spiritual leader, and she's the person who, if you ever start wondering about, the purpose of life, just think of Helen Keller, the one who let us all understand that the purpose of life is life itself. And at home, I have my Helen Keller water oak there in the same pot as my J. Krishnamurti living oak. J. Krishnamurti is my other sort of spiritual leader who wrote The Function of Education. And so I have these 2 trees growing together in the same pot in my living room. So that's one of my emotional stories. Every day I go and I look at those 2 trees growing together and think about the magic of this project. So at this point, I'd like to just talk about, or just ask you to ask me questions about this project, because, all of the other stories in here, all of those magic events that are the chapters here, I could go on all night. But what I really like to do is to hear your stories. The more I talk about this, the more ideas I get, the places I need to go, the trees that I need to see, the seeds that I need to collect and grow. And then, of course, the stories of trees that have connected to your life. So why don't I just open this up right now to questions and comments. Exactly, that's the it of it. Another strange thing is only about 50% of the people, when I tell them about this project, actually get it. And it goes back to that idea of, just arriving at a spot, picking up seeds, putting them in my pocket and leaving. A lot of people don't get that connection. Like, well, how is that a book? Questions? Yes.
There's a photograph of Bronson Alcott, he had a bench around his tree in front of his house. I don't know if that tree is still there or not, but that's quite a famous tree.
Bronson. Okay.
He was Louisa May's father, of course, and a great educator.
Now, everyone must know that the original Walden Pond trees were all blown down in that hurricane of 1934.
Most of them.
Yes, I was really disappointed when I arrived there. That the docent who kind of sort of led me down the paths and told me about the history of Walden Pond said that all of the original trees that had known Henry David had blown down in that hurricane.
There are some oaks that come from the National Park Service from there that date literally 200 years before he was here. So there are white oaks and black oaks that extant during his time that may not have been, shading him exactly, but were certainly in the area, and he was certainly within sight of.
Still alive, you're saying?
Absolutely, in fantastic health.
Right there in the park?
In the park or in adjacent properties and road trees. The main road that goes right through where the Park Service is and the pond is and so on and so forth. There are black oaks on that road that are, 4 or 5 feet in diameter, and they have, 20 growth rings per inch.
Wow.
So the math leads to them being grand old specimens while he was there.
That's great. Thank you for that information.
You're welcome.
When I went to Mount Vernon, I was amazed. As you come in, there's a long road that leads up, and they call it a buffer zone because it's a woods that separates the highway from Mount Vernon. And so I got a chance to talk to the arborist there, and he said, well, there are only 9 trees left that were around when Washington was there, and I met 2 of them, collect some seeds from them. But I asked him, well, what about all the trees coming in, And he said, yeah, that's the thing. And I said, well, what thing? He said, well, I'm trying to get them to let me do a survey of that, because I think there are a lot more than just the 9 on the property. I think all of those woods, I think there's something like 300 acres that they haven't surveyed. So, and he thinks that there's probably some of these white oaks and black oaks.
But the trees are beautiful.
They are
Yeah.
beautiful, and I used to walk around there when I went to school in Boston. I would actually go over there for walks just to interact with those trees. But I did make a point early on in my mission that I wasn't going to go to cemeteries. I only went to one cemetery, and that was in New Hampshire, where Willa Cather died. But it was said that she was buried on the site where she and her longtime companion Edith Lewis would go, and they would read from sections of My Antonia, and they would edit it and so on. And they actually requested to be buried on that spot, which was a cemetery. But they actually went there and did some of the writing.
Right.
So that's why
they were living there. Yeah.
Right, exactly. I thought I would read one small section to you, which really kind of solidifies the getting it of this project. And it happened right here at Walden Pond. And it was one of my favorite moments. One of my favorite moments was going to Walden Pond, because when I entered the woods, it was in September. It was kind of a crisp, clear day, and the wind, the wind in the trees. And the moment I got under the trees, a strong breeze came up, and I was literally pummeled with seeds, to the point where I had to sit down because I was so overwhelmed by the experience. And again, this occult aspect of my personality, I was certain that Uncle Henry David Thoreau was having some fun with me. But anyway, I made my way around the pond, and I finally came to the place where the cabin used to be. Now, you guys know that there's no cabin there. It's out by the parking lot, right? But so anyway, I'll read this. I think you'll enjoy it. So anyway, not far from there, I came to the area where Thoreau's cabin once stood. There is no replica of the cabin extant, thankfully, but there is a replica alongside the parking area. What is there now is a huge pile of rock, or more poetically, an embowered cairn of stones, deposited over the years by pilgrims who have come to pay tribute to the great prophet. John Muir and Walt Whitman visited the site back in the late 1800s, and they too deposited stones on the shrine. I couldn't resist, so I placed one of my acorns on top the highest rock. I stood back and admired my brown little nipple, wondering how long it would remain there before the wind, rain, or a squirrel carried it off. But not far away, in various postures of disinterest, sat a class of high school students, pretending to listen to a male teacher standing in their midst, lecturing them on transcendentalism. He was tall, dark-haired, and mustachioed, with a pale complexion. The sight of it gave me the willies, having been a boring and ignored teacher myself. The students' body language ran the gamut of boredom, from weariness to monotony and gloom. I wasn't sure with whom I empathized more, the harried teacher, the hapless students. One thing I knew for sure: you couldn't teach Thoreau, even at Walden Pond. The best you can do is walk in his shoes. So, trying my best to ignore the tableau, I began gathering acorns in and around the area. There were some tall white oaks up the slope, and some that looked quite old too, so I made my way up there, gathering as I went. Then, as I stopped to place a full baggie of acorns in my pack, I looked back down at the class to discover that every eye, save the teacher's, was on me. And as I slung my backpack across my shoulders, one of the students reached down, plucked up an acorn lying next to his sneaker. He held it reverently in the palm of his hand, examining it. Another student did the same thing, and then another. Thoreau once wrote, "I have great faith in the seed. Convince me that you have a seed there, and I am prepared to expect wonders." Me too. Thank you. Did I always arrive
In other words,
unannounced?
you didn't write and say, I have
Pretty
this
much,
project.
yes. Yes, I did.
Good.
And some of those were disappointing for that reason.
Well, I wonder, having read both of your Concord chapters, your second Concord chapter is much less happy, shall we say,
Mhm.
or magical than your first Concord
Right.
chapter. And I wonder if the lack of a pre-introduction could have something to do with your disappointing visits to both the Emerson House and the Concord Museum.
Well, that's good insight and good reading into this, but if you could, think of it from my perspective. I'm going to come to your site and I'm going to collect these seeds from your trees and take them home with me, with the intent of writing a book about it and planting those seeds to do with as I please later in the future. So I'm assuming, and perhaps it's a leap of faith, that seeds are free. And I'm not sure I want to debate that issue right now, that seeds aren't free, or whether they are or aren't. But I like knowing that I can say to you, seeds are free. I live in a world where seeds are free. The respiration of the air coming from trees is also free. I kind of look at it as the same. So I had this dilemma. Do I call around and tell people that I'm coming and here's what I'm doing? The only time that I had to do this was at Mount Vernon, because, as I say in my book, at Mount Vernon, this is what they do for a living. They harvest the seeds of these trees, and they sell them at a pretty good price, too. And so the arborist, when I told him what I was doing, he did say to me, now, again, you realize that this is what we do for a living. And I said, yeah, I'm aware of it. That's why I'm announcing myself. He didn't say, and that's why you can't go up there and collect those seeds. So he didn't say I couldn't do it. And I did go up there. The amazing thing about Mount Vernon, if you can find those seeds, good luck. They literally must vacuum them up. I was lucky. One of the trees that was there had a huge shrub underneath it, one of these tulip poplars. Now, tulip trees, tulip poplar trees, the little samaras that come off of there, they're even more prolific than maple seeds. I mean, they're just bazillions of them when they explode. And I couldn't find them. They weren't there on the grass. But underneath, in this shrub that I crawled into, and down on my hands and knees, looking like this, I found some, just a little bit. So That's very good reading, and you're probably right. I wasn't very complimentary of Emerson's home, was I? I didn't like the tour. The house is very stuffy and old. But then I realized that house is not very comfortable. So no wonder Thoreau went out there and built himself a little place around Walden Pond.
And did you ever go into the Concrete Museum?
I didn't go in. I did,
Okay.
yes, I'm sorry. I did go inside, yes. And I was going to take the tour, but it was not where I needed to
I guess
be.
the thing that surprises me is that if Thoreau was one of your heroes, that you didn't want to see his desk.
And I probably should have seen it. And again, the magic of all of that, I did see when I went to Lowell, Massachusetts, and I was looking for his home, and they finally did give me his, because they weren't going to give me where he grew up. I asked, they didn't want to help me. They said, well, people live in those homes. You can't just go to Jack Kerouac's home and knock on the door and say you want to look around. People live in those houses, you know. So I'm sorry we can't let you have them. But I went to another place, to the archivist, who gave me his addresses. And so I was able to track down his houses. But while I was there, I found that he had his backpack. They had his backpack, his rucksack, in a plexiglass case upstairs for all to view. It was under plexiglass, and it gave me a real creepy feeling. He doesn't want that stuck in a plexiglass with all the lights coming down, you know. So maybe Thoreau didn't want me to see that desk in that
It's
museum.
not in plexiglass either.
What's that?
It's not.
It's not in plexiglass. And so, of course, this is a mission that's, you know, I'm going to go, when I leave here, I'm going to go back to down the road here to Emerson's house and just look around. They have there's white pines right outside his bedroom window. I think there's a big oak tree that's definitely was around when he was there. So good question. You know, not everyone liked what I was doing. You know, people were watching me sometimes when I was, walking around, like Tennessee Williams' house, in Clarksdale, Mississippi. You know, he grew up in a rectory. You know, there's a church there, and so I was walking around unannounced. But again, I was on the sidewalk. The seeds are, in my world, the seeds are free.
Can I make a comment about
Sure.
that? Trees and taking care of trees and even taking care of them after they've died is my life. And I can tell you from a biological standpoint, when you say that the seeds are free and should be free, every tree has evolved to do pretty much one thing: procreate and spread its seeds as far and wide as it can, and any method that it can utilize due to how biology really works. Any way that seed can be spread and
Even
go
us.
forth and be brought to another environment and flourish, you are doing for those trees exactly what they would most dearly wish you to do. So,
Thank you for that.
yeah,
So,
I mean, you're really doing what
Yeah.
they strive their whole life to do for themselves.
exactly. So actually, all of this, we're playing right into their hands, aren't we?
Absolutely. They're in charge, not us.
Thank you. That's wonderful. No,
Does anyone have any other questions for Rick? I guess you would be operating on the principle of asking forgiveness instead of permission.
Yes.
Right, and when it comes to
Excellent. Thank
collecting
you.
seeds. Well, I really appreciate the connection between trees and literature, and have you spelled out your adventures for us.
Friday, May
Thank you.
13th.
This is a